Hi, Frank.
Hey, Bob. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
I'm
How are
fine.
things in Washington?
Things have been extremely cold.
Same up here, coincidentally.
Yeah.
In Washington, I left there 6 years ago. And I guess the city has recovered from my departure. That's no longer...
No, that's not. We're still devastated, and we miss you.
A big blow to the city's self-esteem,
Yeah.
I guess. And plus, there was 9/11 about the same time.
Right.
Thanks for taking the time to talk to us. I wanted to talk a little bit about Iraq, for starters. Are you about as pessimistic as the average person?
Well, no, actually, thinking about it some, I am actually a little bit, I think the pessimism is overdone, because I think that people have been imagining a lot of worst-case scenarios, which are admittedly pretty bad, about spiraling civil war and then intervention by all of the regional powers and the things spreading to a regional war between Shiites and Sunnis and possibly even an interstate war. That is certainly possible, but I think that there are actually probably some equilibrating forces that will prevent that from happening. Now, there's a separate issue about the U.S., Israel, and Iran, and we can talk about that separately, because there I do think that there is a real risk of a conflict. But as for Iraq itself, I think that actually if we look at this a little bit more dispassionately, or apart from the emotions created by the intervention itself, the current situation is one in which these two very extremist anti-American groups, the Shiite militias and the Sunni insurgents plus the foreign jihadists, are all basically spending a lot of their energy fighting each other. And that's not necessarily the worst position for the United States to be in. I mean, the moral issue is a separate one. Since we created this situation, we obviously are responsible in many ways for what's happened. But from a cynical standpoint of U.S.
Pretend you're a realist for a second.
Yes, pretend, right, let's take this great leap of imagination and pretend we're a realist. The situation where these two anti-American groups fight each other to exhaustion is really not the worst thing in the world. And I think that the regional states probably have the good sense to understand that this is a very dangerous situation, and that they probably, will fight this thing out through proxies, but don't have a direct reason to get involved themselves unless one side or the other looks like it's about to win and create a much more desperate situation. But we're not there yet now. So I think that you certainly can imagine a whole range of outcomes, but not necessarily a terrible one from U.S. interest standpoint. From the standpoint of the Iraqi people, I think it's going to be very grim no matter what.
Well, it does also raise, you would concede, the prospect, not entirely improbable, of a regional conflict. I mean, you're right. It could well be contained, and everyone could act judiciously. But that is among the downsides of a Sunni-Shiite conflict.
Well, of course, but everybody seems to be expecting this regional conflict, and I just think that the way a lot of these civil wars work, they tend to go on, for a while. But at this point, the real question is how balanced the sides are, and I think that they are moving pretty much closer into balance, so that it's unlikely the Sunnis will come back to power, that foreign jihadists would never seize power in any event, and the Shiites can take care of themselves, but they're not going to be able to pacify Anbar province. And in the longer term, this sets up a situation of, as in other civil wars, where there's a stalemate, and then that's the ultimate basis for a political compromise.
Right, although in this case you would have the downside of there being quite a few terrorists who weren't terrorists, many of them, 6 years ago, with nothing to do. Many of them would presumably leave Iraq, especially since at the end of this, the Sunni Baathists may more or less expel the Sunni jihadists, right?
Well, yeah, but again, that's not the worst. President Bush made this case that it's better to fight them over there than here, which I think was a silly idea, because all we're doing is providing them with more targets. On the other hand, if what they're doing is fighting Shiites over there, they're getting ground up in this civil war. In fact, Fareed Zakaria had a piece about this, that, Al-Qaeda actually hasn't been so clever because now they've started basically this civil war with one of the most powerful social groups in the Persian Gulf region. And that may not be so good for them in the long run.
Yeah, of course. Even your hope of a not too bad outcome depends on wise American policy, right?
Yeah.
And we have reason not to be totally optimistic there. I mean, first of all, there's Iran, where for all any of us knows, Bush really is just looking for an excuse to make this a bigger war.
Well, I don't know that he's looking for an excuse, really. I think that they probably would like to somehow settle this without, because they're not stupid. The U.S. military is really overextended at this point, and taking on a third war is, I think, going to cause a really big constitutional crisis in the United States. And I think if they could get to their objective without having to do that, they would do it. I think that what complicates this is, the real panic that exists in Israel, where I think a lot of people believe that Iran is really not deterrable, it's not a rational actor, and that therefore they live, under a kind of imminent existential threat. And so I think even if Bush is not himself willing to start something, it could either escalate out of a tit-for-tat, hot pursuit kind of situation growing out of Iraq, or the Israelis could act. And then once that happens, our calculation then changes, and I think what would have been an extremely unpopular war becomes a little bit less so because of that connection.
Yeah. There's also, this may seem like a crazy thing to throw into the equation, but I was just having this conversation with somebody, and I was claiming that as somebody who actually, as a child, attended Southern Baptist Church in Midland, Texas, and I've been bragging about this to a certain extent lately on Blogging Heads TV, but my origins in Midland, Texas, but I do claim to have some insight into Bush's religious psychology. I really do think, it's kind of there is evidence that he really believes that God told him to invade Iraq. That's Pat Robertson's testimony. It's a reasonable surmise. My understanding of the way his psychology would be working now is that if he thinks God guided him to this and it didn't work out, this must be the stepping stone to a larger success. And that really worries me. Do you think that's crazy? And by larger success, a larger war. Like okay, we're going to do Iran too.
Well, I don't know about God. I think that you can leave God out of the picture, and you could still imagine that Bush, really believes, on completely secular grounds, that a nuclear Iran is simply not tolerable, and that his ultimate legacy is not going to be whether he launches a third unpopular war in the short run, but whether he prevents this from happening. And he doesn't have to get reelected, nor does Cheney, and so I think that may be a sufficient motivation to determine his behavior without having to refer to God.
Yeah. It's kind of a microcosm of the whole dynamic that you're talking about within Palestine right now. That is to say, first of all, you have, although it's not Shiite Sunni per se, there is intra-Muslim strife that some people are taking as good news, because it's taking the wrath off of Israel and off of us. And actually, one of the sides is sponsored, by the Persians, as the Sunnis say, which in other words, the Iranians. And you also have now people can argue about whether it would be good news or not to have a civil war in Palestine. I don't think so, but you also see one of the benign forces you're counting on in the larger Middle East, which is the Saudis, for example, stepping up and becoming a regional power that will assert itself for the sake of stability, right?
I don't regard the Saudis as a particularly benign force, but
you're counting on them to counterbalance the Iranians in Iraq, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's.
That's kind of good news, in a sense. Right. You're saying, it seems to me a good outcome is in the whole area is going to have to depend on on powerful and wealthy nations deciding they have an interest in stability. And, you know, in any event, you've got this... I mean, are you heartened at all by this deal that was brokered by Saudi Arabia to possibly bring, you know, a unity government in Palestine? Or are you among those who actually think a civil war would be a good thing?
No, I don't believe that civil wars are ever a good thing. I'm just saying that if you're not involved in civil war, it's you know, the consequences for you are not necessarily terrible. But what is important is that peace settlements oftentimes require the two sides realizing that they don't have military options to improve their position, and hopefully you want them to get to that situation quicker rather than later. But sometimes it takes, you know, fighting the thing out for it to happen. In Bosnia, unfortunately, you know, that it ground on for quite a while until you got there, and you want to accelerate that process. But you know, to some extent, people have got to exhaust these other options before they get ready for a peace settlement. And I think the two sides in Iraq are nowhere close to having exhausted themselves, that they're ready to make fundamental compromises.
Okay, speaking of Bosnia, there was an interesting piece in your journal, The American Interest, by Michael O'Hanlon and Edward Joseph.
Mm-hmm.
That was interesting because it was among the you know, scenarios painted in Iraq that consists of something other than just surge and something other than just withdrawal. Mm-hmm. There have been a couple of interesting pieces, Ed Lutlock's piece in the New York Times, and then this piece. And there, as I understand their argument, what they would like to do is kind of ease Iraq, use our forces to ease Iraq toward a kind of soft partition. That is to say that they don't envision, you know, Iraq being divided into sovereign entities, but somewhat autonomous entities that are nonetheless bound by a federal government that is preserved, and there would be the, you know, distribution of oil revenues among the provinces, and so on. And one of the things that our forces would help do is what was done in Bosnia, which is to, you know, and people feel differently about how moral a thing this is, because it seems like you're almost assisting ethnic cleansing when you do when you abet peaceful population transfers to make the landscape more ethnically homogeneous. But it was done apparently successfully in Bosnia. And do I have their argument about right? And what
no,
do you
that's
think
right.
of it?
No, I mean, if you remember back in the Bosnian conflict, you had this attempted Vance-Owens plan, which was really a kind of liberal pluralist solution that would keep these neighborhoods ethnically mixed and have a non-ethnic government. And that simply didn't work. And the Dayton Accord that eventually emerged was based on accepting the reality of ethnic cleansing with population transfers and the consolidation of those groups into more homogeneous ethnic neighborhoods. And that's really the only thing that made Bosnia possible. And I think realistically, I would imagine that you may end up with something like that in Iraq. It's certainly not a desirable option, but I think it's in certain conflicts the only workable way that you're going to get to peace. And I may point out that a lot of the peace that has existed in Europe and the Mediterranean in the 20th century comes out of this kind of population transfer, you know, between Greece and Turkey, between the Sudeten Germans and the Czechs, between the Poles and the Ukrainians, between the Poles and the Germans. I mean, all of these countries had intermixed populations, and to the extent that you've gotten greater stability, it's because they became unmixed. Now, I think the big issue then is, can these population transfers happen without, you know, the violence that accompanied partition or the ethnic cleansing, you know, and that in the Balkans, and that's really the, you know, and I think O'Hanlon and Joseph are perfectly aware of that precedent and that danger. And so the question is, can you actually facilitate transfers that don't lead to innocent, you know, busloads of people simply being massacred as they're moving from one neighborhood to another?
Yeah, the piece also called my attention to the difficulty of doing this kind of thing. I mean, one of the parts of this that they outlined was a kind of oil for land deal in Kirkuk. I mean, yeah, basically that's what it would be. That some of the Sunnis would give up land and more or less turn Kirkuk over to the Kurds, I guess, in exchange for being assured that in the long run the Sunnis would be cut in on the oil revenues. And what struck me is that, you know, it's hard to imagine the Sunnis trusting that you would really follow through on that deal, which points to the larger problem that in Iraq now we have no source of authority that is trusted. And when you're going to broker complex deals, you need a source of authority that is trusted. I don't think the American presence is trusted there, or the durability of our presence is trusted. The Shiite government isn't trusted. You know, that's what makes me pessimistic, among other things.
Yeah. Well, that's certainly true in the Balkans. You had an international community that wasn't fully trusted, but you don't really have a counterpart of that right now.
Yeah, I mean, was the UN in a certain sense the repository of trust in the Balkans? Mickey Kaus and I were talking about this and trying to remember what the analog would be.
Well, it was, I mean, the United States actually played a much more active role. You know, Dick Holbrooke was really the architect of Dayton, so it was under a UN umbrella, but it was actually more the active intervention of the United States, and we obviously cannot play that role in this conflict any longer.
Okay. Well, let's move to something more upbeat. You did this op-ed piece for the Los Angeles Times, in which you said that the glass of water is half full, at least. I mean, you started off by acknowledging that the conventional wisdom is basically an outlook of gloom right now. Right. And at the beginning, you recited some of the reasons for the gloom. And I got to say, you did such a good job of that that. But, you know, by the time I got to the inspirational part, I was just about ready to seek counseling. But, you know, you ran through, you know, Russia's been regressing politically. Of course, there's all the stuff in the Middle East. Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador are busy centralizing power and reversing the trend of the 1990s toward openness and economic integration, and on and on. And all this is why, helps explain why the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists has moved the hands of its doomsday clock to 5 minutes to midnight, 2 minutes closer to the figurative end of civilization. Okay, so you've got us all depressed, and now what is the good news?
Okay, well, it's a couple of different things. Part of it is economic, because the world, if you don't think about this from an American perspective or a Middle East perspective, which, you know, those two have become merged in many respects in the last few years, but you look at it from a global perspective, the period since the collapse of the dot-com boom has been an extraordinary period of economic growth. People are getting richer all over the world, and a lot of people are coming out of poverty. And this is nowhere more true than in the world's two largest and formerly most impoverished countries, China and India. But it's not just those two. If you look at virtually every region, sub-Saharan Africa has been growing at almost 5% a year for the last few years.
Yeah, that surprised me when I read that in your piece. That I wasn't aware of.
Latin America has been doing extraordinarily well. The Middle East, apart from Iraq and you know, the immediate environs, Lebanon has been doing well. Now, economic growth in itself does not mean that you're going to have political stability, and oftentimes economic growth can actually trigger political instability. But I think it's just worthwhile to remember that this is growth that has happened in an extraordinarily turbulent time. Comparable shocks to the political shocks to the global economic system in the 1970s sent the whole world economy into this tailspin. You know, the rises in OPEC oil prices, and you know, that led to the debt crisis in Latin America. It led to it led to very high levels of inflation and real, you know, recession in the United States, collapse of the stock market, same thing in Europe, and none of that has happened in this turbulent period since September 11th, which indicates that there's a kind of robustness to the global economy that we didn't experience in the 1990s when everybody was celebrating it. So, and it's not a trivial thing if, you know, hundreds of millions of people around the world are really doing materially better than they were previously. So that's one thing. On the political side, I think that there are a number of reasons not to get too panicked at this point about some of the trends. We already discussed my view that Iraq and the region in general may come to a kind of balance of power, because it's not just up to the United States to balance a resurgent Iran. There are plenty of other people that are willing to do that, and those forces, are now gearing up, and the question is whether you can reach a equilibrium or whether the thing escalates. And I don't hold a brief that it won't escalate, but as we said earlier, most of the players have a strong interest in not seeing that happen. The nuclear issue is the one that I am particularly concerned about, and I guess just to start out, I don't want anyone to get confused on this. Iran getting nuclear weapons is really a bad thing for a whole variety of reasons, but there is a particular fear that has been articulated in the last few months especially by a lot of my former neocon friends that would say that, in contrast to every other power that has aspired to nuclear weapon status in the past, Iran is different because they will not be rational. Ahmadinejad is a member of a messianic cult and basically would be willing to engage in first use of nuclear weapons without concern for nuclear deterrence or retaliation, because they all think they're going to heaven, or that it's driven by a religious ideology. And I just think that we ought to examine that proposition very, very carefully. I think there is no precedent for ideology. You have to think of how crazy the Chinese were in the Cultural Revolution, and they had nuclear weapons, and we didn't worry about them losing that basic rationality. And if you look at Iranian foreign policy since 1979, they have said a lot of crazy things in the past in terms of wanting to destroy Israel and spread Islamic revolution all over the globe. But their actual foreign policy, when core national interests were at stake, has been actually quite careful. And I think it's a long stretch to assume that they will not be rational if they get the bomb. And again, I hope it doesn't happen. We really need to put a lot of effort into seeing that it won't. But I just think that there are the kind of apocalyptic fears out there right now that, if unchecked by a real discussion of how serious they are going to lead us once again to do really dumb things. And I think that's what happened after September 11th. We, as a nation, overstated the real catastrophic terrorist threat from Al-Qaeda. It was a real one, but it's one that I think once you start paying attention to it, it's one that you can reduce the chances of quite substantially. And but many people, believing that it was a much larger probability threat than I think it really was, were then willing to do things like torture people and invade other countries and take other kinds of extreme measures in order to head it off. And I'm just worried that the way the debate is going now, we're going to put ourselves in a similar situation.
Yeah, I think I largely agree. I mean, as for the China comparison, some people would no doubt point out that, communist ideology does not include a belief in the afterlife. But I think, it's true that, it's worth pointing out that Ahmadinejad, first of all, whatever his personal beliefs and whether or not he's in an apocalyptic cult, the fact is that Shiite theology, broadly speaking, including the kinds prevalent in Iran, is not especially fervently apocalyptic any more than mainstream Christians are. That is, they expect the apocalypse to come eventually. They're not especially eager for it or impatient for it. And as for him personally, so the question turns to him personally. Is he a member of an apocalyptic cult, and so on? And I don't know exactly what his beliefs are. I would say that most of the things that he said that have scared people to death have an explanation as being calculated political rhetoric. That is to say, they have succeeded in endearing him to, for example, Sunnis on the street, which is one of his goals, and so on. And the other thing I'd say is his own profile seems to be, if anything, in eclipse. I mean, in order for him to get to a point where he could launch nuclear weapons, he would have to amass more power in Iran than he's ever had by far, and more than presidents there traditionally have. And secondly, his power seems to be declining at the moment, as I understand it, right?
Yeah, I mean, whether it's declining or increasing, I think Iran is a very complex country. It's got a number of different power centers. He controls one, but he's not the supreme leader. He doesn't institutionally control the Revolutionary Guards and the Basij and a lot of the other power ministries that really control the country. So I think he is not going to be, even if he wanted to do this, which I kind of doubt. I mean, it is just so easy. Again, you have to remember that when people were talking about nuclear war in the 1950s and the consequences of nuclear retaliation, Mao had this famous line where he says, "Yeah, we could afford to lose 50, 100 million people." So people have said really scary things in the past, but I do think that there is a track record of a lot of different states, including Iran, when push comes to shove, actually being reasonably careful. So, there's plenty to worry about, but I think that particular apocalyptic fear is one that we have to be, cautious about, because if we really believe that's true, it really does justify a whole range of extreme options that I think will get us into bigger trouble.
Okay, now as for your the economic sources of your relative optimism, that is optimism compared to the average observer these days, the aggregate numbers you cited in both South America and Sub-Saharan Africa are encouraging, but I guess I'd say two things. As you note, a lot of the money in Sub-Saharan Africa is coming from natural resource extraction, basically, and that's not traditionally necessarily paving the way to long-term prosperity, not building the kind of social capital, educational infrastructure, and so on that you might hope for. And in fact, natural resource extraction is often used by authoritarian governments to remain authoritarian and to remain corrupt. And B, in Latin America, as you said, I mean, aggregate prosperity is important. And standard of living for middle class is important, but income equality is also important. And this is ultimately actually going to lead us to your Wall Street Journal op-ed. I don't want to talk about that quite yet, but anyway, what's your...
Well, okay, let's begin with Africa. The cases are really quite different. It is true that growth that's derived from natural resource rents is not an ideal form of growth. But, you're talking about a region where over a generation you had absolute declining per capita GDP. People were getting steadily immiserated. And so to be in a situation in which at least part of those economies are growing is really a tremendous turnaround from the pattern of the past couple of decades. And also, there is a kind of improvement in at least certain elements of governance. Most of these countries, including very corrupt ones like Nigeria, have pretty much eliminated their foreign debt. And if you think about the amount of time that Jeff Sachs and Bono and Bob Geldof have put into the whole question of debt relief, with all of the familiar problems that it creates, constraining your current budgets because of all these mistakes made in the past, it's pretty good that most of these countries are actually paying down debt and are not going to face anything like the same constraints that they did over the past couple of decades. So that's Africa. Latin America, I think that I go down to Latin America quite a lot, and I've been all over the region in the past couple of years. I think that Americans have a very distorted view of what is really going on there, because first of all, we take the small countries in Central America more seriously compared to the big countries in the Southern Cone, and we also tend to focus on conflict. Now, there's a real problem in the Andes, in Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela, because of the indigenous populations that haven't been cut into a share of political power, and because of extreme economic inequalities. But other parts of the region are doing better. Brazil, has been one of these countries with a very high degree of inequality, but its Gini coefficient, which is how economists measure the degree of inequality, has actually been coming. It came down in the 1990s after it opened up to the global economy, and as I can't remember which article I pointed this out in, but they've had these very interesting social programs.
It's the Wall Street Journal piece.
Yeah, the Wall Street Journal piece. These conditional cash transfer programs. They've got a very big one in Mexico, and they've got a really big one that reaches about 15 million poor people in Brazil. That seems to have had actually a measurable impact in reducing inequality. This is a program where the government identifies poor people in poor neighborhoods, and they say to them, if you put your kid in school, we will pay you a stipend, no questions asked. And it's raised school attendance, and it's actually put cash in the hands of a lot of poor parents who otherwise would send their children out to work. And so I think that, if you just need to take a more balanced view of other things that are happening, including some positive development. I guess the other thing that, maybe only an economist or some sort of financial market person would pay attention to this, but Latin America over the past 4 or 5 years has gone through exactly the same ringer that it went through in the 1970s, rising oil prices that in the 1970s created this huge current account deficit that was financed by basically printing money. The Latin American debt crisis was the result of their mismanagement of that external situation. The same thing has been happening over the past 5 years, and all of those countries are doing well. They're managing it, extremely well. There's not hyperinflation in any country in Latin America today, and so I think that's the glass half full part of the story. You can focus on Hugo Chavez and all the problems in Venezuela, but I think he does not speak for Latin America.
No, and in fact, he's had some failures lately, like getting a seat on the Security Council. Let me. This does bring us to your Wall Street Journal piece, and let me say a little something about that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if we have time later, we're gonna talk about an idea you champion on this concert of democracies,
Mm-hmm.
and as you know, I'm very critical of that idea. But let me. First, if we do get to that will certainly be counterbalanced by my view of your Wall Street Journal piece, which I really think is one of the most important op-eds I've read in a long time. For two reasons. I mean, one is that, I had long been kind of, there was this kind of, you might say, this consensus that the Washington Consensus had failed. The Washington Consensus was kind of, the way the U.S. and kind of Western economists in general were saying the world should be run. You should have you should have free trade, somewhat managed or guided by international institutions, but everyone should open up their borders. Everything would work out well. Then there was a big backlash against that in, among other places, Latin America, and it had to do with, for example, the seeming failure of free trade to improve things on the economic inequality front and things like that. And I had long been wondering, what is the substitute for the Washington Consensus if that has indeed failed?
Mm-hmm.
And I think your Wall Street Journal piece really addresses that. And the other thing I like about it is, and tell me if this is the wrong take-home lesson, but one way I would put an implication, and maybe you're almost explicit about saying this in the piece, but that the national security of the United States depends on improving the lot of poor people around the world,
right.
Which is something I believed, but you took a kind of a totally different angle into getting there. I mean, you start off talking about these various, the U.S.'s big kind of enemies, or these antagonistic parties, Hezbollah, Hamas, Chavez, and why don't you go ahead and explain where you go from there?
Well, it begins with this observation that actually what makes these anti-American parties and militias and demagogues popular is the fact that they have a social agenda. So Hamas and Hezbollah actually run clinics, schools, charities of various sorts. They help people rebuild their homes. Hugo Chavez has invited all these Cuban doctors and opened eye clinics and food distribution centers and so forth. And so it's actually the fact that they have an active social policy to meet needs of poor people in areas like health and education that is the source of a lot of their political power. And I just think that we in the United States, our politics over the last 30 years, ever since the Reagan Revolution, has been devoted to cutting back the social sector and social spending. And a lot of the impact of Washington consensus-type programs, to get budgets into balance and impose its austerity, the first thing that falls victim to this is social spending. Now, I think that in the past, that was actually quite justified, because the other important point in this article is that it's really hard to do good social policy. It's very easy for that kind of thing to get out of hand, to actually have these, for example, in Latin America, you have all these labor laws protecting the jobs of people that have jobs already, just as in Western Europe, and the result is that you don't have that many jobs, and everybody else is forced into the informal sector where they don't have the same kinds of legal protections and so forth. And so the wrong kind of social policy, I think, can be very counterproductive. But, we Americans have largely been brain dead on this subject. When Alvaro Uribe, the president of Colombia, was here recently, he was saying, he needed he's a conservative president who's been fighting a struggle against, the FARC and the ELN in Colombia and trying to disarm the right-wing paramilitaries. But he said quite explicitly, I get lots of advice on economic policy when I'm in Washington, but I don't get very good advice on social policy. But I desperately need something to offer the poor of Colombia. And I think that that's something we ought to take to heart, because I do think that the combination of elections and free trade is fine, but it is not a sufficient agenda to either win the hearts and minds battle, if you're thinking of it just from the standpoint of U.S. foreign policy, or to actually, help people around the world if you just care about it from a development standpoint.
Yeah, no, and that, hearts and minds is an interesting phrase, because one thing the piece drove home to me is that, we've heard that in the context, in an Islamic context, mm-hmm. right? We're fighting for the hearts and minds of young, potentially alienated Muslims, but I do think a more far-seeing view realizes that potentially down the road, 20, 30, 40 years, epic terrorism could come from any extremely alienated group. Mm-hmm. And if we think about this in the long run, we will think about this being a struggle between us and extremist elements for the hearts and minds of the disenfranchised everywhere.
Mm-hmm. It's funny, the much maligned 2002 National Security Strategy document actually has this very good line in it. It says that poverty and this kind of despair is not the cause necessarily of terrorism. A lot of the terrorists were middle class and so forth. But, it creates conditions for that they can exploit very easily to gain popularity. And it's also, our indifference to those kinds of issues also hurts us. It's a source of anti-Americanism, because we have to be seen as doing things like promoting democracy and development, not just because it's good for us in the short run or it's somehow an instrument of our foreign policy, but somehow that we want to do it for its own sake. And that's one of the big problems with the way that the Bush administration has put democracy promotion kind of front and center as part of its national security strategy. I believe that the United States ought to support democracy around the world, but when you instrumentalize it in this sense, in that fashion, it really kind of poisons the well in a lot of ways. And so I think we need a policy that actually promotes good social outcomes for people, not in the sense that it's going to have an immediate payoff in terms of our security, but it really improves the image of the United States, and it does lessen some of the background conditions that create these security problems for us.
Yeah. The one other kind of related thing is I think, the governments that are going to be probably most easy to get to be cooperative in fighting things like terrorism and various other ills are probably going to be governments that are kind of finely intertwined in the global economy. They have a strong interest in working with us to keep, to keep the world a kind of stable platform and so on. And so that's an argument for the kind of free trade that makes nations intertwined. But if free trade is creating domestic problems such as social inequality, or at least failing to solve them, it's just going to be a hard thing to sell. Anyway, I thought that was just really an important piece. And I guess what I would say is that, what is the post-Washington consensus? It's something like, yes, free trade. And, first of all, with some amendments, I think, for example, more and more economists are saying some kinds of capital controls at the national level are not the unmitigated evil they used to say. But moreover, the whole thing should be supplemented by what you could call social policy on an international level, which is going to involve a lot of exploration to figure out what the best social policies are. But the point is, it's got to go beyond our borders.
That's right.
Now, do we have time to talk about the concert of democracies, or are you going to get off the hook?
Yeah. Okay. Let's have at it.
Okay. This is an idea you champion. In fact, today I was talking to Dan Dresner, the eminent blogger and blogging head, and he reminded me that you've really been championing this since your book, The End of History.
Yeah, that's right.
At the end of History, you have a few, I don't know if you use the phrase concert of democracies or community of democracies, but why don't you tell us what the idea is?
Well, actually, it's not my idea. It's really the original Kantian idea for a League of Nations, because if you go back to his essay, Perpetual Peace, which is usually taken to be the original inspiration for international, liberal internationalism, he doesn't talk about simply a United Nations where every sovereign government participates. He says a league of governments that have a republican form, that is to say that are basically democratic and liberal, because only they would have a sufficient degree of legitimacy and kind of common interest to actually act in concert to deal with international problems. So it's not my idea. It really does. I think that was the original Kantian view of what liberal internationalism ought to be, but it was one that the United Nations did not follow because they did not base international cooperation on any substantive view of justice. They simply said, well, whoever is sovereign will be represented, and we're not going to ask about whether they oppress their citizens or what their form of government is.
Okay, and this is an idea that lately has gotten a certain amount of play because it's mentioned favorably in the Princeton Project, of which you were part. There's a recent piece by Ivo Dalder and James Lindsay in your journal, The American Interest.
Right.
And in the modern, in this incarnation of it, one of the main things that it would be about is humanitarian intervention, right? I mean, one of the perceived failings of the United Nations is to intervene forcefully in places like Somalia, where intervention seems to be in order, and that's one of the big voids that this is supposed to fill, right?
Well, you could imagine it doing a number of things. One example actually would be Kosovo, where you could not get a resolution through the Security Council because of Russia's opposition to doing anything to its ally Serbia. And so the other European countries and the United States simply moved the venue to NATO, where virtually everybody is a democracy and the Russians don't have a veto, and you were able to try to legitimate that intervention based on a NATO vote rather than a UN vote. And I think that there are situations in which you couldn't get the Security Council to act, maybe in Sudan or other places, but you could get a concert of democracies to, pass a resolution condemning it. I think that those are the more demanding scenarios. I think in other respects, with regard to democracy promotion, it would be much better if it came out of an organization like this than out of Washington. I mean, right now, it's hard to get anyone in Iran to accept any, money for purposes of organizing civil society groups or political parties or free press or anything else, because nobody wants to take Washington's money. And I think that in terms of spreading democratic norms and values, it's better if Poland and Chile and Korea and Senegal and Mali, were at the forefront of pushing this kind of an agenda rather than the developed democracies, and particularly the United States. So I think there are a lot of potential uses of an organization like this. Okay.
Now here is the main part of my problem with it. Okay, it would be, by its own definition, an important organization, first of all, because among its capabilities would be military intervention when it deemed it appropriate, and it would see its own imprimatur as bestowing legitimacy on the intervention, and membership in it would be considered a really significant accomplishment because, it would be saying basically, look, you've got to have, a kind of highly evolved form of government. You've got to be a democracy to be part of us. And so there's clearly a value judgment entailed in whether you're allowed to belong to it or not. So first of all, you would have a certain number of arguments breaking out about who is qualified to get in and who is not. And I think most of those would not be good things in my view. But the main thing I don't like is that it seems to me it would accentuate a couple of fault lines that need bridging. I mean, for example, you would basically be saying, here's this very important organization, and you've got to be really good to be in it. And here's the deal. The United States can be in it, and Israel can be in it, but by and large, Arab countries can't be in it. And the United States can be in it, and Japan can be in it, but China can't be in it. And that's another big fault line, between Japan and China, another dangerous fissure, just as there is between Israel and the United States and the Arab Muslim world. And it seems to me that's a pretty big downside right there. And if I thought, the reason, it's interesting, there's the coalition supporting this is a combination of kind of, I would say, neoconish people, plus a number of liberals, such as, Anne-Marie Slaughter. I think John Eikenberry, he's maybe slightly more ambivalent than you and Anne-Marie, but I think supports it. And I think the main appeal to them, a big appeal to them, is the humanitarian intervention thing. But I think when you look at it, it's not clear to me that they wind up, that the concert of democracies winds up having meaningfully more legitimacy than we had before. And Kosovo's a good example. I mean, okay, look, we wound up getting it done with NATO, and the way it was perceived was as follows. The U.S. considered it a legitimate intervention. Western Europe did. NATO did. The people in Kosovo did. The Serbs didn't. The Russians didn't. And that's that's the exact way it would be if there were a concert of democracies.
Well, sure, but Bob, I mean, it's not as if these fissures don't exist in the absence of this organization. They do exist, and a lot of the trouble in the world is actually caused by these non-democratic regimes. And if you're going to have collective action to do something about it, it is more likely that the cooperation is going to come between countries that share common values. So, right, it is going to accentuate some of these fissures, but I think that the question is what's driving the problem, the underlying problem, and a lot of it is undemocratic countries that are willing to do terrible things to their own people, as in the case of Sudan right now. So that's right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the interesting question is Sudan a place where this really would accomplish intervention that is not being accomplished now? If so, that would certainly work in its favor. I think Kosovo is not an example of that, although that's commonly cited by advocates of the concert of democracies.
Yeah. And maybe my overall view is that this is one of many new organizations, multilateral organizations that we need, because my idea of multilateralism is that if you have if you populate the world with a lot of different alternative types of organizations with different forms of legitimacy, different memberships, some overlapping, some functional, some regional, you will get, more alternative ways of approaching the solution of some of these international problems. And so this one it's not going to solve a lot of important problems, but it'll solve a certain class of problems, and I think that's it's better than not having anything. And I think the important, I guess one of the important things for me in in arguing for this particular one has to do with American politics. Many Americans, and I would include myself in one of these, believe that the United Nations itself has got a real legitimacy problem because it, again, does not enshrine a substantive view of what is a legitimate government, and so you get a lot of dictatorships that are, oppressing their own people as members in good standing of that organization. I think if you asked a lot of Americans why they don't like the United Nations and are not willing to accept its legitimacy and seek legitimacy from it, it really has to do with that democratic deficit. And this organization, for example, if it had said, no, actually, we think that the Iraq War is not a good idea, and we're all democracies here, I think that might have had a more persuasive impact on American public opinion than the Security Council saying that. Now, there are limits to this because one of the big objectors was democratic France, and that didn't stop people from disregarding them. But I do think that that legitimacy issue about the United Nations, the fact that many of its members are not democratic, is a real obstacle to its getting better traction and support within the United States. And again, if you don't get that internal American support, it's hard to, for these organizations to do much of anything.
Well, yeah, but I would say, as for Iraq, that's actually a case. I mean, if this is supposed to do things the UN can't, the fact is the UN performed very admirably in Iraq twice. First, in Persian Gulf War I, there was a clear violation of the Charter. There was aggression against Kuwait. The UN-sanctioned forces rolled it back. Secondly, in the run-up to this war, the Security Council succeeded in getting, in conjunction with the deployment of threatening American force, I agree, but the Security Council succeeded in getting UN inspectors in there. They were being allowed to look wherever they wanted by the time we actually invaded, and Bush just screwed it up. The UN had performed quite admirably.
Well, look, I'm not advocating abolishing the United Nations. I think we ought to keep it. I mean, it'll do certain useful things, but it won't do other useful things. And so I just think that this organization will be able to do certain things that the United Nations won't be able to do. The United Nations will actually be able to do certain things that this organization won't be able to do. So I just think that the more the merrier, I guess,
but part of the point I was trying to make was that in that case in Iraq, in certain parts of the world, including parts of the Arab world, not necessarily Iraq itself, the UN had more legitimacy than this concert of democracies could possibly have if we're excluding all Arab nations from it. And secondly, on the more the merrier thing, I mean, time and energy are finite resources, and there's a lot of work to be done on the international institution building front. The UN needs radical reform, structural reform, if we're going to modernize it. And it just seems to me, the very people we're talking about, John Eikenberry, Anne-Marie Slaughter, they're the people who could be focusing solely, on UN reform. And when I see them spending their time on this stuff, I want to grab them and,
Well, I guess this is where I still remain a neoconservative. I just think that...
I was going to make that accusation, Frank. Yeah. I'm glad you did. Go ahead.
I just think that, I just think you look at the reform agenda for the United Nations, there are just limits to whether, how much you can fix that organization, given the basic premises, the going-in premises. And so I think you could spend all that energy on that organization. You're still not going to have something that will work effectively in the cases where you really want it to work.
Yeah, I think you've isolated the residual neocon in you that is yet to be expunged, right. And we'll be working on that in the future. But I think you've made so much progress that we should end this on a note of congratulations.
Okay.
And I really do appreciate your spending the time. And I do want to say again that every American should read that Wall Street Journal op-ed you wrote, which we'll link to.
Okay. Thanks very much.
All right.
All right.
See you around.
Bye.